Understanding Addiction Through a Trauma-Informed Lens. We're very excited to have you all join this programming today. As you're joining, please feel free to share your name, organization, where you're coming from in the chat. Really excited to see who's joining us in the room today. And we will go ahead and get started with a little housekeeping before jumping into our programming. So the webinar will be recorded and a copy of the presentation will be available on the Life Unites Us website. All attendees will be muted throughout the course of the webinar. We encourage, if you have any questions for attendees, to please use the Q&A panel on the bottom of your screen. The chat is also available and will be being monitored throughout the presentation, but for any specific questions, it would be helpful just so that we can route the questions to our speakers during our Q&A portion. For the best audio quality, please listen to the webinar via phone line by using the dial-in number. And to switch from computer audio to phone audio, select audio settings on the lower left screen. If you get disconnected from Zoom, please re-enter using the original link. The host will let you back into the meeting. So we'll start off with a little bit of an agenda. We've done our welcome and our housekeeping. I'll provide a little bit of a campaign overview for anyone that might be new to the room, and then jump into our speaker introductions. We're joined today by Trish Caldwell and Danina Bayudi, who will be speaking on trauma-informed care, and we're really excited to see what they have in store for us. And then we'll wrap up with a question and answer. So for anyone that is new, anyone attending their first Life Unites Us webinar, just want to provide a few introductory slides about the campaign and the work that we have been doing so far. So we are in the third year of our campaign, and Life Unites Us is an evidence-based behavior change public health intervention designed to reduce addiction-related stigma of substance use disorder in the state of Pennsylvania. So the campaign is a collaborative effort between Shatterproof, the Public Goods Project, and Penn State Harrisburg, and we work in close partnership and are funded through the Department of Drug and Alcohol Programs, DDAP. So at the root, our campaign is based in storytelling. We work with individuals from across the state of Pennsylvania to collect stories of recovery and allyship and share them through our social media networks, amplifying messaging that is supposed to reduce stigma associated with SUD. Our goals include increasing knowledge about substance use disorder and that recovery is not only possible but probable, improving attitudes towards those living with and are in recovery from SUD, and strengthening the capacity of stakeholders already responding to the crisis on the ground. In terms of pillars of work, we have a couple. For community engagement, we learned very early on that community partners are trusted messengers within their spheres of influence. We work with over 160 community partners across the state of Pennsylvania to be able to make sure that their voice is at the decision-making table and make sure that the campaign is guided by the work that they're doing, and also being informed by the current state of affairs in Pennsylvania and making sure that they're resharing our messaging and amplifying that messaging throughout PA. So to that point, we have had a community impact committee since the inception of the campaign. They consist of 6 members that meet on a quarterly basis, and they really are meant to guide the voice of the campaign, all the work that we do, and provide input and feedback into the various components of our work. In terms of content sharing, as I was explaining before, we are a campaign that is rooted in storytelling. We work with people in recovery and their allies to reshare their stories across our social media platforms. And in conjunction to that, we also develop digital assets that are available for partners to reshare on their social media platforms as well. In terms of education, we do technical assistance via our webinar series, which we do on a bi-monthly basis. And the topics that we hone from that are informed by our CIC, community partners, and are really meant to fill in some of those gaps that community members might want to learn a little bit more about. And on this next slide, I just have some example content of digital assets that we've been able to develop as part of the Life Unites Us campaign. For any community partner that is partnered with the campaign, they have access to a bank of digital assets that they can use to download as needed. And then here's an example of one of our stories. If you visit our website, you could see over 200 stories that we've been able to collect through the campaign. So if you haven't already, please follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. If you're interested in sharing your story, you can go to our website and complete our interest form. And we're always looking for more community partners. So please complete our intake form to set up an informational call and just learn a little bit more about how we can collaborate on reducing stigma. So without further ado, I want to jump into our presentation by starting with our first speaker, Trish Caldwell. Trish is the Vice President of Clinical Services at Promises Behavioral Health, a regular speaker at both national and regional conferences. Trish specializes in adolescent behaviors, behavioral health, ADHD, trauma-informed care, family systems, and first responders. Trish holds her master's in family therapy from Drexel University and is a licensed clinician in the state of PA. She is certified in both co-occurring disorders and substance use. Trish has worked in the behavioral health field for over 27 years. She's committed to evidence-based practices that align to a trauma-informed approach to treatment. As an adjunct professor for the last 16 years, she teaches for Drexel University's MFT program. And additionally, Trish created the first young offenders treatment program in Delaware County, serving first-time offenders with drug charges. So with that, I'll stop sharing my screen, and Trish, the floor is all yours.
All right. Well, I appreciate everybody having me today. I'm excited about this topic of conversation. This is one of the conversations that I will say I think is one of the most needed within the field of behavioral health. And I think in light of the pandemic, and certainly even prior to the pandemic, the conversation of trauma-informed care and the way that we understand how trauma impacts those that we're serving, and the way that we can directly start to create evidence-based practices to be able to align to the mission of helping sustain a recovery for those that have been impacted by it. I don't know why it's not allowing me to get to the, so I apologize. I can't pull up the bigger screen. I don't know why it's not allowing me to do that. I apologize for that. So when we start to look at, I'm going to do a brief review. This is a quick training, so I want to make sure that I'm being respectful of our time, but also to hit some of the key components. And so I'm going to hit a little bit of kind of what we understand about what trauma-informed care is in regards to what SAMHSA has identified. We're going to talk a little bit of the tenements of what that means. I am then going to further go into what that looks like within the practice. So how do we, as individuals that are servicing those in the recovery community and behavioral health, how do we understand what trauma-informed means in the ways that we begin practicing for them? So when we look at the 4 basic assumptions, and then we're going to talk about the 6 key principles, the 4 assumptions of trauma-informed care is that idea of realization, recognition, our response, and then our ability to resist the idea of what re-traumatization is. And so when we're looking at how that translates into the work that we're doing, it's the realization about trauma. So how do we educate ourselves and our communities about what it means and what the symptoms look like for those that have been impacted by trauma, how we organize within our own facilities and create systems that are able to recognize the signs of trauma. So instead of looking at the behavioral symptoms as something that we need to either manage or punish, how do we recognize those symptoms so that we can create the compassion and the interventions to be able to heal somebody and begin their journey? And how do we respond? So the response and the resist to re-traumatization, I think, are pretty critical pieces. And again, I'm going to apologize. This is a short training for a very long topic, obviously. But the way that we respond, so historically, what we have seen in behavioral health is that at times what we do is we react. And so somebody demonstrates that they have been impacted by trauma and the experiences that they have lived through, and behavioral symptoms come out as a result of that. And what has happened is oftentimes we react to them. Trauma can be an internally experienced process for somebody that maybe engages in self-harm or depression, but it can also be an externalizing process where somebody might engage in behaviors that are appropriate within the signs of a hypervigilance and a level of acuity. And so when we start to learn how to respond to that person individually, it allows for us to be able to support their recovery. And then that ties into that resisting of re-traumatization. When you are trauma-informed, when you have an organization that is trauma-informed, then you are moving through the process with that individual that allows for them to get regulated. And you're going to hear a wonderful speaker afterwards that's going to talk about mindfulness. Again, a lot of research-based information that we know in regard to the importance of regulation. When we look at the guiding principles of trauma-informed, again, I'm going to go over this pretty quickly. But when we're looking at these and what it means from Sansa's concept of the 6 principles, safety, so that means not just physical safety, but emotional safety, psychological safety. So do you have policies and procedures in place that allow for an individual to know that they're in an environment that's going to support their experiences? And so when we are still a reactionary, behavioral health and substance use in particular, which is where I spend most of my time, you know, there are anecdotal stories of what we're supposed to do in order to treat those that have been impacted. And what research continues to demonstrate is when we engage in an individual through the compassion and understanding of the brain, it provides an individual the psychological safety that they need to begin their recovery. So trustworthiness and transparency. So those are keys. So making sure that you say what you mean and mean what you say, and you follow up accordingly, that we know that this is an individual that has been highly dysregulated. And so having some level of structure and consistency and transparency and honesty, their whole brains have been wired to assess the environment. And it is our job and responsibilities to make sure that we are transparent and trustworthy so that we are not putting them on a hypervigilant path. Peer support and mutual self-help, so getting them involved in the community, alumni, and other support groups is a key foundation of trauma-informed, because we know that individuals do not heal alone. And so trauma-informed work means that you heal within the connection of those that are surrounding you. Collaboration and mutuality, so they should be an integral part of their own treatment. You should be able to have conversations with them about what their goals are and help them to align to their goals. And that should be a collaborative, reciprocal relationship. Empowerment, voice, and choice. So it would be against trauma-informed care to tell somebody what they need to do, as opposed to having conversations about what it is that they would like to do and how we can help to serve them to move them closer to that. And then again, our own knowledge of cultural, historical, and gender issues. So our individual experiences as a provider to make sure that we are informing ourselves so that we are providing that psychological, emotional, and physical safety for the individuals that we're serving. I hear how fast I'm talking, so I apologize, but I want to make sure I get to some of these. So trauma-informed care and trauma-specific treatment. So this has come up a lot. So depending on where you are within the context of treatment and in the continuum. So trauma-informed care means that you have created policies and procedures in place that align to being able to respond to an individual who has been impacted by trauma and to actively resist re-traumatizing them through our practices and our policies. Trauma-specific treatment, which oftentimes should be seen in the full continuum of care. So when you're looking at somebody going into an outpatient level of care or in private practice, then you might see more trauma-specific treatment, meaning those are going to be helping you get closer to a narrative for, and this is where evidence-based practices becomes a huge part of a trauma-informed practice. So for an inpatient level of care, it should be that you have the foundations of trauma-informed care. And that means that you are actively working towards helping somebody to understand, create awareness of when they are activated or triggered, as some might refer to it as, and then how do I regulate and respond differently? That is very different than what historically people have talked about in regard to the narrative. So trauma-informed is that we're going to provide safety, physical, psychological, emotional safety. Trauma-specific treatment is then the direct interventions that somebody might make in order to help somebody move through that. And that should look different according to the continuum. So more about regulation and awareness in the beginning. And then as somebody begins to manage their recovery over the course of time and through a full continuum of treatment, they should be able to engage in more specific treatments that are appropriate for that individual. When we look at what does trauma do to us, recognizing this as a chronic, that trauma interferes with the neurobiological development and the capacity to integrate sensory, emotional, and cognitive information into a cohesive whole. So what does that mean? That means that at a very foundational level, when somebody has experienced chronic stress and trauma, the neurobiological parts of their brain have been impacted. More specifically, which we'll get to, 3 core parts of the brain, and I'm minimizing it pretty significantly, that have a lot to do with the way that we see recovery within substance use. So that prefrontal cortex, which is a part of the brain that is responsible for the thoughts, your recovery, weighing choices, that as a result of ongoing trauma becomes minimized, and the more reactive protective part of the brain, the amygdala, that limbic system, that becomes more prominent in the responses of an individual. So when we look at treatment early in the phases of when somebody accesses treatment, the majority of the work should be focused in on that limbic system and below, which we'll talk about, rather than the cortex, which is the last part of the brain to develop and is the least utilized early in recovery, because evolutionarily, we are organized to survive. And so those more primitive parts of our brain help us to survive. So substance use and trauma, again, there is a tremendous amount of research. And so most clinical programs will address one or the other. Oftentimes they will say they address both. But in order to really be trauma informed, it means that you have engaged in active policies and procedures to be able to support that mission that we talked about earlier with SAMHSA. And so when we start looking at substance from Seeking Safety, that quote, which I think stands out so significantly to me, substance use is the scab trying to protect the trauma. So when we think about what that means, and for those of you that work in the field of substance use, we recognize that phrase of the substance isn't the problem. The substance use is the solution, right? This is what somebody found, that when they were so dysregulated as a result of the experiences that they have endured over their lifetime, what they did is they found a temporary solution that made them feel better in the moment. So when somebody comes into treatment, and this is where those trauma-informed principles come in, when somebody comes into treatment, it is incredibly important for us to recognize the symptoms that they come in with are a direct result of us ripping off a scab. If you were to rip off a scab, you would expect what you would see underneath. You would expect that it is raw, that it is vulnerable, that it is messy. And so when somebody comes into treatment, that while they are moving through the recovery process, when you rip off a scab, you should expect what you see underneath. And that individual is going to be more raw. They're going to be more dysregulated. And so our ability to respond to them as opposed to react to them is one of the foundational aspects of safety. So trauma and substance use, I'm going to skip over this because what I want to highlight is substance or the symptoms, and then I'm going to skip over probably a couple slides and really speak specifically about kind of those brain states that I was saying. So again, if I'm trying to pull away a couple of takeaways for everybody today. So when we look at the symptoms, these are the symptoms of an individual who has been impacted by trauma and who likely have a substance use disorder. So when we look at low frustration tolerance, poor impulse control, these are not judgments. These are a direct result of the way that the brain has been impacted. So if you think about it from an inpatient level of care, a low frustration tolerance might mean that if you are working with somebody and you have a smoke break that is 10 minutes late, that individual might struggle with being able to get regulated enough to be able to say, hey, I was really upset about having this late smoke break. And instead, what it would be is that this is an individual that might get very reactive, that might threaten that they're going to leave treatment against advice, that they might start becoming argumentative with the staff and saying, where were you? I can't believe you. And so when we see these as the symptoms, there are 2 ways that we can look at this. You can react by saying, who are you talking to like that? You need to settle down. Or if we are engaging in trauma informed, then we respond. And we recognize that they are struggling. That's why they are accessing treatment, with their ability to be able to control their impulses and manage their frustration. That is an indication to where their brain is predominantly being activated. When we look at these symptoms, these are the majority of those that we are treating. For those that you look at, so if all of us think of right now, like think of a couple of your patients. For the patients that see this the most, where we recognize like, wow, I've got patients that are really dysregulated all the time. I always say this is like a window into their past. Some of our patients are going to be 20 miles into the forest. Some of our patients are 7. If you are 20 miles into the forest, then you are likely more frustrated. You have a difficulty with being able to manage your impulses. You are more reactionary. That is indicative of somebody that's experienced trauma. Somebody that is 7 miles into the forest that maybe is able to manage their recovery a little differently or quickly is likely somebody that doesn't have as many experiences that have pushed them further into the forest. And so a key takeaway from this when we look at trauma informed is that for somebody that has experienced significant trauma and being 20 miles into the forest, there's only one way to get out. If you're 20 miles in, it's 20 miles to get out. That's an important piece, because when somebody starts to look at, well, why is that person managing their recovery differently? How come they move through they've only been in treatment 3 times or 1 time? The reality is that if you're 20 miles in, it's going to take you 20 miles to get out. This is all about helping somebody to be able to begin healing the brain and calming, like taming the brain, allowing somebody to recognize that, helps them to recognize, even though you were 20 miles in, you're 17 miles out. And so your story is pure to your experience. This isn't that you don't deserve recovery. This isn't that you aren't capable of it. And it's certainly not that you're trying to undermine your own recovery. This is that you were 20 miles in, it's going to take you 20 miles to get out. And this is all the work that we're doing here. That's the shift. So these are the symptoms. When we change the way that we view the symptoms, we change the way that we are able to respond to our patients. So I'm not going to go over the adverse childhood experiences. If you have not ever seen that, I highly suggest you Google that, adverse childhood experiences, Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, where they talk about a research study by Vince Bellitti and the CDC that has highlighted how the brain is impacted by somebody who has had these early childhood experiences. The higher your score, the higher your risks. And so we as practitioners, when we know this, it allows for us to drive the ways that we start to integrate evidence-based practices to be able to heal the brain. There is additional research that has been done. So again, because this is geared more towards the state of Pennsylvania, Philadelphia has also done their own adverse childhood experiences study. And so there's additional data and outcome that has come out to help us understand. So what do we need to do collectively as a profession to be able to help people to manage their recovery? So this is the part that I'm going to end my part of this presentation so that I can turn it over. When we look at the brain and its development, this is a critical part of trauma-informed care. Our brains develop from the bottom to the top, from the back to the front. And so at the very bottom of our brain is the brainstem. This is the more reptilian part of our brain that is basically coming to us. This is where our personality exists. This is where our respiration, so all of the instinctual behaviors that we don't consciously have to become aware of. So your respiration, your heart rate, those are all a part of it. As our brain continues to develop, and your brainstem is where all sensory information comes in. As our brain continues to develop, we have our limbic system. This is the emotional part of the brain that is responsible for our pleasure reward center, so the nucleus accumbens that rewards us for behaviors that it wants us to do again. This part of the brain makes decisions based on what works, not what's good or bad, right or wrong. It makes decisions as to what works. So for a person that has been experiencing significant flashbacks, if they have profound isolation and depression as a result of their traumatic experiences, and they met a substance that alleviated those symptoms, their brain in that moment, because also near that nucleus accumbens, the reward center, is the hippocampus that's retaining memory. It says, do that again. So when we talk about like urges and cravings on a very fundamental way, this is where the brain has learned when you have this extreme distress and you use a substance, in that moment, it worked. not right or wrong, good or bad, but what worked and what didn't. That's where it gets reinforced. This part of the brain is reactionary. It is impulsive. It is living in the moment of survival. So when the bigger the trigger in that limbic system, because this is also where your fight or flight, that amygdala, the fight or flight and freeze response is also sitting in this limbic system. So for somebody impacted by trauma, figuratively, not literally, their amygdala, the smoke detector of the brain, gets bigger and bigger. The larger it is, the less the cortex works. Because in evolution, if you were to be confronted by a bear in the woods, your limbic system would make a very quick decision as to what you need to do. Do you need to run from this bear? Do you need to fight this bear? Or do you need to play dead, freeze? It makes a very quick decision. And what it doesn't need is your chatty little cortex trying to weigh the pros and the cons. It doesn't need your cortex being like, I don't know if you should run, should you, because you would die. So what it does is literally it shuts it offline. So when you engage with a person that's managing the recovery and they say, I don't know why I did that. I don't know why I know I should have done something different. They are telling us by their behaviors that they were activated enough that their limbic system became dominant and their cortex, the rational part of the brain that says you shouldn't do that, was offline, not activated at all. It literally shuts off that communication highway. So in that early phases of recovery, and that's where mindfulness comes in, which is what I'm going to tie into for our next speaker, that limbic system, when we become mindfully aware, when we engage in regulation skills that help to tame the brain, it allows for somebody to start building the recovery capital that would allow for them to get to the cortex. Those are some of the skills. So when we talk about safety activities, and this is the segue into the mindfulness, asking a patient and defining what safety is, what the sights and the smells and the sensation, to become aware of when you feel activated, even if you don't know why you are, because the majority of our triggers are below our awareness, our threshold of awareness. So having somebody become aware of, can you tell when you are activated, becomes a part of the trauma-informed approach to be able to engage somebody into the recovery efforts. So with that, I am going to stop sharing my screen and turn it back over to Ashley.
Thanks so much, Trish, and wonderful presentation and perfect segue into Danina's portion of our programming. And I'll start by just doing a really brief introduction of Danina and then handing over the floor to her. Danina is a 20+ year mindfulness practitioner and the owner of Sage Action Consulting. She has spent most of her career as a consultant with human service agencies with a focus on cross-system trauma-informed approaches and drug and alcohol prevention needs assessment, planning, and evaluation. Danina is a mindfulness teacher, trainer, and facilitator who works to create inviting spaces and practices for learning and growth. She believes mindfulness-based embodiment practices, music, expressive arts, and stories shared in supportive settings offer opportunities for healing and recovery. She served as a mindfulness expert on Governor Tom Wolf's trauma-informed PA think tank and continues as a member of the HEAL PA training and organizational support action team. She's a proud mother of a transgender son who has taught her more about trauma sensitivity than anyone else. So the floor is yours, Danina.
Thank you so much, Ashley. Thank you, Trish. That was wonderful. I really appreciate all of that information that you shared. And that was such a wonderful segue into what's coming next. And I think I'm going to start it from the beginning. And Ashley, if you can give me a thumbs up if you can see it. Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you. That was, Trish, that was wonderful. And I really appreciate all the information that you shared. And I'm really glad that you talked a little bit about the brain health and the brain, because I'm going to very, very briefly talk about one little thing with how mindfulness helps with our brain. Why don't we, before we even get started, if you do not know this, sighing is something that is really good for our nervous system and really good for our body. You probably naturally notice when you do something difficult or you're tired, you go, oh, right? So maybe just take a couple sighs. just to kind of reboot everything as we get ready to segue into this next portion, where we talk about mindfulness as a tool for recovery support. And you can continue sighing. You can sigh a couple times if you'd like. I want to offer a few permissions, things that I don't say these as guidelines or anything. These are permissions. These are things that you are permitted to do during my portion of the presentation. The first is take care of yourself and your needs however you want. With a webinar, it's even easier, right? Because nobody sees you. Get up and stretch, get a beverage if you need to. This is being recorded, so if you won't miss anything. Everything is an invitation. I believe that mindfulness is best experienced. So we're going to have an opportunity to practice it a little bit later. So I invite you to participate in whatever you want. If something does not feel right for you, opt out of that. And take what you like and leave the rest. It's the best advice I got from someone once at a conference where I was feeling very overwhelmed, right? You're getting all of this new information. And they said, take the golden nuggets. So I invite you to take the golden nuggets from this presentation and just leave the rest. Leave the rest. You've probably heard of mindfulness. It's kind of hard to probably be on the earth at this time to not hear about it. And you may have heard of different definitions. There are so many definitions out there. I like to set the tone by saying, first and foremost, I believe mindfulness is a skill. I think it is something, and if it's a skill, it's something that we can all learn. I think it's a skill that helps us to live more fully in the present moment, which is really when life is happening, is right now. Mindfulness is noticing what's happening and allowing it. That's why I have that and really big. We're noticing our thoughts, our emotions, our body sensations, feelings, our environment, but we're noticing in a different way. It's like noticing the weather or being a witness. Like, for example, if I notice it's raining out there, I'm not going to judge the rain or be angry. I might be upset that it's raining, right? If I had plans to do something outside, but I'm not going to judge the rain. I'm not going to say the rain is bad. So we're trying with a mindfulness practice, we're trying to do the same thing, is notice what's coming up, notice what's present, allowing it, not judging it, just being there with it. And mindfulness is practicing specific exercises as well as doing ordinary things with focus and curiosity. We're just paying attention on purpose. We're being intentional. This is one of my favorite definitions from a meditation teacher named James Baraz. And I know there's a lot of famous people that have definitions of mindfulness, but this is by far my favorite. He says it's simply being aware of what's happening right now without wishing it were different. So you're enjoying the pleasant without holding on when it changes, which it will, and being with the unpleasant without fearing it will always be that way, which it won't. So being with whatever is present right now in this moment. There are so many gateways to mindfulness. And you may, most people think about the bottom center, and the bottom right? You think about somebody sitting in seated meditation, or maybe somebody getting ready to do a yoga practice. But any of these other activities can help you to be fully present, to live fully present in the now. Maybe it's playing music, maybe it's creating art, cooking, hanging out with your dog, going for a walk in nature. I have the shower head there intentionally because doing ordinary things, maybe you can be fully present the next time you take a shower, really feeling the warmth of the water and smelling the soap, rather than, I like to say, maybe already being in your meeting that you have later that day. So why mindfulness? Let's talk about, before I talk a little bit about mindfulness as why it's important for people in recovery, let's talk about it in general. Mindfulness is a portable skill. So I have this little suitcase here. I love it because you can take it with you anywhere to improve stress resilience. It's not like, oh, I forgot my gym clothes, so I can't go work out. You can always access the present moment, and it's always with you, that skill, and it improves your ability. Stress resilience is that natural ability to bounce back from a stressful experience. We're going to experience stress in life. We can't, a degree of stress, is healthy, right? But sometimes it takes us longer to bounce back from those experiences. So mindfulness can help us to be a little more resilient in that realm. It deepens your appreciation for everyday life. So you can see the world maybe through a lens of abundance instead of scarcity, what's good instead of what's bad. And neuroplasticity. Really, Trish talked about your brain and what is present while somebody is experiencing addiction or in treatment. Well, neuroplasticity, that's the most exciting thing I think about mindfulness. And mindfulness practices can change your brain. That means they can create new neural pathways or structures in your brain. And when Trish was talking about the amygdala, how the amygdala, that's our brain's smoke detector, right? Responsible for fight, flight, or freeze. And that often someone that's in, the early stages of treatment or recovery, that's where they're operating from. It's hard to access that prefrontal cortex, that higher part of your brain. Well, mindfulness practices in time can shrink the amygdala, can shrink that part of your brain that is reactive, and it can create more activity in the prefrontal cortex, that part that's responsible for executive decision-making. And I think that's really exciting. So let's talk about recovery. I'm kind of a word nerd, and I like to know what words mean, where they came from. So looking at the word recovery, I liked that it means, when we actually look at what it means to return, to come back, maybe to regain or restore. And when we look at it from using that, that root meaning, we're all continuously recovering as humans. We're constantly coming back to a state of equilibrium. That's that state of restoration. We're coming back from life stressors, from mental or physical illness, from trauma, from addiction. Every night we go to sleep, right? And our cells are recovering every night. Our body's recovering. Now, mindfulness practices can help those in recovery. There's a few things that are essential about them. One is it grounds you in the present moment. Activators, or what some people call triggers, take you away from the present moment. It puts you maybe in the past or propels you into the future. These practices also help you to come back into the window of tolerance. Dr. Dan Siegel was the person that first introduced this concept of the window of tolerance, and that's your optimal emotional zone that we could all exist in to thrive in everyday life, right? If we're in that window. And Trish talked a lot about reaction versus maybe in learning to respond versus react. And mindfulness practices give you that power and teach you. I really call it a superpower because it teaches you to respond instead of reacting. Responding is conscious, is thought-driven. Reaction is emotion, is limbic brain, is survival. Now, mindfulness for recovery management, if we look at it just in general, it's really a beneficial tool to get you out of autopilot. Think of how often we are all going through life on autopilot. And that sometimes we don't make the best decisions when we're on autopilot. So by getting us out of autopilot and getting us to really focus, we can be more intentional with our choices. It helps you to regulate the nervous system, to be operating within that window of tolerance. And it's like a Swiss Army knife because there's different options for your needs in the moment. It's not just a knife. There's also the scissors. So there are various things that we can do in the moment to meet the needs of our nervous system. And then non-judgmental awareness, that allowing whatever comes up to come up without judgment can really bring healing from those feelings of guilt and shame. And that really can really just change the way you relate in the world. So just approach it with more kindness and more compassion. Now, Trish talked a lot about a trauma-informed approach from SAMHSA's perspective. I'm going to give you just a real watered down one, I guess. When I am teaching, when I'm offering any type of practice, when I'm present as a student, there are three things I look for, and that's safety, control, and predictability. And whenever we experience trauma, those are three things we lose. We lose that sense of safety, we lose control, we lose predictability. So safety, if you're somebody that is holding space for someone, or you're holding space for people in recovery, or just holding space for any group, working on creating an environment for physical and emotional safety. And that does not mean saying this is a safe environment. Actually, that kind of drives me crazy when someone says that. We try to create an environment by implementing trauma-informed approaches. We can never guarantee it, but we create that environment. One of the ways we do that is by offering options, right? Giving people that choice to opt out, and empowerment and choice so that you can have your own experience. And then predictability is really important. Starting and ending on time, explaining what to expect, and showing up with a regulated nervous system, right? Showing up within your window of tolerance instead of very dysregulated. Now, looking at mindfulness through a trauma-informed lens, there's a couple things that I typically do. I check in to see what's needed, what I need, or maybe what others might need. Do you want more of an internal focus? Or maybe if your internal landscape is really feeling a little active, maybe an external focus, like going for a walk or focusing on something external outside of your yourself, and whether you need activity or stillness. And really getting to know that window of tolerance for yourself and others so that you can recognize those warning signs if you're starting to merge into that danger zone where you're getting activated, that hyperarousal, or maybe you're going into disassociation or you're numbing out. That's hypo, you're going. So just being aware of that for yourself and for others. Consider grounding options other than focusing on the breath. The breath sometimes is not really accessible to people, so there are some others that you can choose from. And incorporating movement. There's a lot that could be said around this, but we know that movement, trauma can sometimes get stuck in our body. So movement can help to release it. That's why I believe indigenous cultures shake, right? They use a lot of shaking in their healing. So I know I went through that very quickly, but I would like to give us the opportunity to experience mindfulness in a few moments before we go to our question and answers. So I'm going to guide you through a few gentle movement exercises. We're going to do a really short mindful movement and music experience, and then a short meditation. So I invite you to get comfortable, however you're seated, maybe standing. Just take a few moments to maybe notice where you're making contact with the floor or your chair. If it feels good for you and nourishing, maybe noticing your inhale and your exhale. And I invite you to just move your head in a way that might be nourishing for your neck. And I'll give you a few suggestions. Maybe you might want to move your ear down towards your shoulder. Or maybe you may want to turn your head from left to right, or any other variation. Maybe your head wants to move in some little circles. Just see what feels nourishing for your neck right now. Gentle movements. And then bringing your head back to center. And we're going to bring our shoulders into this. So if it feels good, maybe introducing some little shoulder rolls, and you can maybe roll both shoulders back, or maybe explore one at a time. And you can make these real small, or maybe you want to bring your whole arm into your shoulder rolls. And maybe exploring moving forward as well as back, just kind of loosening up that joint. And then I invite you, if this is accessible to you, to imagine your arms are wings. And as you breathe in, you're going to open those wings just as far as it feels good, and maybe looking up. And then as you breathe out, you're just going to bring your arms back, maybe bringing your chin to your chest, just opening our chest and our upper back. So opening those arms on your inhale, your exhale, just bringing them back, bringing your chin to chest. Just flowing through that a few times. Only opening your arms and rolling your shoulders back as much as it feels comfortable for you. Maybe doing one more and coming back to center. And then let's just wiggle our fingers a little bit. And maybe you even want to wiggle your toes. And then we're going to just kind of paddle our hands up and down. And you might want to do the same thing with your feet. My foot is cracking. I hope nobody can hear that. And maybe just rotating those wrists and doing the same thing if it feels good with your feet in one direction and the other. And then we're going to get ready to move to some music. Now, again, this is an invitation. Maybe you want to tap your head. Maybe you want to explore shaking. Maybe you just want to tap your feet. Or maybe this is when you want to go get a drink of water. But this is very short, a minute and a half. Just allow yourself to explore what it feels like to move to music. Maybe staying seated, maybe standing up, maybe shaking a little. Parts of your body. I'm gonna stand. Clap long. Feet. Now take a moment and just notice. Notice any sensations in your body, anything that's present. Finding a comfortable position, maybe remaining standing. If you were standing, maybe seated. Just gonna explore our senses briefly before we end. So maybe you want to take a moment to just look at this beautiful sunrise. Or maybe you want to expand your vision and look around the room. We're going to just focus on that sense of sight for a moment. So maybe taking this moment, look around your room, or to just look at this beautiful picture. And then letting go of that focus on what you see and just shifting to your sense of hearing for just a moment. Taking a moment to notice any sounds that are near and maybe sounds that are further away. And before we return, just taking a moment to notice anything that's present and to allow it. And then maybe doing whatever feels natural to bring your attention back. Maybe you want to take some fuller inhales and exhales. Maybe you might want to move your body a little bit, moving your fingers and your toes. Just bring your attention back. I'm going to just quickly show you these other slides. Take your time coming back if you'd like. I have some resources for you to check out. There's my contact information if you would like to connect with me. If you liked that movement experience with music, you have the chance to do that again a week from tomorrow. As my involvement with Heal PA, there will be an opportunity to do that Wednesday night, 7 to 7:45. You can check out my website and you'll be able to register. I'm going to turn it over to Ashley because I know we want to allow time for questions. I went a little fast there with our mindfulness experience, but I hope that you enjoyed that. I'm going to stop my share and turn it back over. Actually, no, I'm sorry, I'm turning over to Jayla.
No, we are starting our Q&A. Thank you so much, Danita. That was excellent. Such a wonderful exercise to get us in the mood for Q&A. I do want to mention that Trish had to hop off. She had another presentation that she was going to, but she did ask me to share her email in in the chat for anyone that is interested in connecting with her. She also did want to mention that she will be doing a 2-hour trauma-informed presentation training in a couple of weeks. So anyone that's interested in that, please feel free to send an email. We'll also be sending information about that via our newsletter and follow-up emails about the webinar. So with that, we do have a couple of minutes left. So do want to route some questions over to you, Danina. I am seeing in the chat that a lot of people are interested in your track that you shared. So feel free to drop whatever that, that was in the chat. But I do want to start with just some of the questions that were routed our way. And so, just to get us started, why is an understanding of trauma important for the addiction workforce?
Well, I think the main reason it's important is because pretty much everyone has experienced it. Everyone you meet has experienced some type of trauma. It's pretty hard to be living on this earth and to get through this life without experiencing trauma. So I think that's one of the most important reasons to understand it, is everyone's experienced it. And also because to understand, I think Trish explained it so beautifully, to understand that brain science behind it. So that when somebody is, they're in those early stages. I love the way she described the scab being pulled off. If everything is so raw and vulnerable, to be able to understand that, then you're able to maybe meet somebody where they are, to meet them in their treatment journey, in their recovery journey.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think as a good follow-up, a question that someone put in the chat was around how individuals are able to cope with their trauma. So, would it be an assumption to say that everyone with a substance use disorder experienced trauma either in childhood or as an adult in their life? And would you say that the core issue isn't the trauma itself, but that individuals were unable to process and cope with their trauma?
Thank you. That's a great question. I think Dr. Gabor-Mate speaks a lot to that. And I think people, if anyone in this audience does not know Gabor-Mate, please check him out. He talks about that. He talks about how it's not necessarily the trauma that we've experienced, the actual thing we've experienced. It's what happened inside when we experienced that. And were we alone when we experienced that? Or did we have somebody that was able to help us process it? So I think that it's very important then to recognize it's not necessarily what happened, it's how people responded to it. And I believe Trish talked about it, using a substance, that was a way. Gabor-Mate even talks about how that was how you survived. That was your way of coping. So I think understanding it in that way, that was a coping mechanism. So in order to let go of one form of coping mechanism, there needs to be another. We need to teach other healthy ways so that somebody can learn from that. I'm not sure if I totally answered the question there. I think I went off a little on a tangent. I apologize.
No, I think it's a very, convoluted question too, and, a lot of different considerations to keep in mind.
It's in my presentation, but it's Gabor, Gabor, and Mate is spelled like mate, M-A-T-E. Thank you, Paul. Yeah, he's really dedicated his life to studying this. So he's definitely someone I would say to check out.
Yeah, and just as a follow-up to that, why should trauma-informed mindfulness or other forms of trauma-informed tools be incorporated into recovery support? And I know that your presentation covered a lot of that too, but in terms of just stating the importance of having some of these resources available for individuals.
I think trauma-informed mindfulness is so important because I believe mindfulness is such a powerful tool because it really teaches the opposite of addiction. Addiction's automatic behavior. Addiction is trying to, get away from what you're feeling, where mindfulness is sitting in that, whether it's good, whether it's bad, experiencing it. But if you're not offering that in or any treatment, right, or any type of modality, if we're not doing it in a trauma-informed way, we run the risk of re-traumatizing people. And I think mindfulness is a practice where a lot of people are re-traumatized. The perfect example I'm going to give is closing your eyes. Whenever I'm looking for meditations to share with people, and probably if you look on YouTube, they always say, close your eyes. They automatically say closing your eyes is always an option. So because it may not feel safe for somebody to close their eyes. So always offering choice, thinking about what is safe for that person, what is predictable, showing up with your nervous system regulated. Has anyone been to a yoga class or a meditation class where the teacher's nervous system was like dysregulated? Because I have, and that's not helpful for someone. So I think being very mindful of, am I creating a setting that feels safe? Am I coming with a regulated nervous system? Am I offering choice? That really allows somebody to experience those tools in a way that isn't re-traumatizing. And I think a lot of typical mindfulness classes maybe are not always aware of that.
Yeah, and I really like what you mentioned about the option of choice, especially, just providing options for different individuals to meet them where they're at. So to kind of follow up to that, there was another question that asked, how can we start practicing mindfulness today? So if someone is starting, brand new and just wants to incorporate some of this into their practice or into the practice of their patients or the individuals they work with, what can they start doing today?
Oh, there's a couple easy things you can do. On your drive home, if you're in an office, really be in that moment on your drive home. So notice maybe everything around you. Okay, maybe driving isn't the best example. Let's take a better example. Because driving, you're focusing. I don't know what everybody's driving home is. A very simple practice is if you have the ability to go outside or maybe to open a window. I think it's probably beautiful this time of year everywhere. Just take 30 seconds or a moment to maybe look at what's outside your window, or to smell the fresh air, or to listen to the birds. That's one way you can practice mindfulness. Just raise your arms up and raise them down. A simple, tiny thing like that. Playing a song you like and dancing to it. Those are some very simple ways. When you cook dinner tonight, or when you wash I'm giving you a bunch of examples. When you cook dinner tonight, can you be fully engaged in cooking dinner and really chopping those vegetables or washing the dishes? So any simple little task can be an opportunity to practice.
Thank you so much for that. So I know we're quickly running out of time. I just want to ask everyone to complete the survey, which Jayla submitted via the chat. This is a way for us to be able to gauge the offerings that we're offering to you. So always want to make sure we're delivering the best presentations possible. The presentation and a recording of this webinar will be available on our website after we have finished recording. And for any questions in the chat remaining, we will go through and try to answer them in our follow-up emails. We've provided Trisha's contact information as well as Danina's. So if you have any, want to follow up with them and learn more from the various offerings that they have, we would encourage you to do so. So again, thank you so much for joining this webinar. It was a pleasure to be with you all today. And I hope you have an amazing rest of your day and practice the mindfulness. Right.
Yes.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.